Hello, I'm Hannah Rogers, Head of New Business and Client Lead at Blue Yonder Research. And most importantly, for the purpose of today, I am an R&D and Innovation Specialist. And we'd like to welcome you to our recording, Thriving Through Innovation in a Tough Economy. I'd like Kristo to introduce himself to you.
Thank you, Hannah. My name is Kristo Shivachev, and I'm the founder of Simple Design Works. We specialize in design strategy and human-centered design.
Brilliant, and thank you so much for joining us today. So the next 30 minutes, we're going to give you a high-level introduction to our 5-point innovation framework, which will hopefully inspire you. We're always more than happy to talk through any of the points in a lot more depth, so enjoy.
So before we go into the subject, Hannah was just going to invite you to actually tell us how the relationship came about, the Blue Yonder Simple Design Works relationship, because it's been a very exciting 18-month conversation and it kind of led to this webinar. So I thought it might be useful for setting up context.
Absolutely, and I will say I haven't got Kristo's excuse. I have done hundreds of webinars and conference speaking, and I'm still likely to say something that sounds a bit strange. So bear with me on that. If you've met me before, you know it's not unlikely to happen. So yeah, about 18 months ago, we were actually a client of Kristo and his companies. They came to us with a particularly tough design brief from a client where they needed foundational understanding, and this wasn't just the average understanding. This was precise technical detail. They needed to know the user experience in full, absolutely holistically, end to end. It was those edges, those details with very precise recommendations. And I think the best way to describe it is we sort of say what to do and why, and Kristo's team, it was very much how. And that brought us on to problem solving together. And over the past 18 months, this relationship has changed from client and supplier to friends. We are friends, I'll say that. We are friends, aren't we, Kristo? But also a very a very solid partnership as well. And it's one of the themes of today. So we have developed a sort of a 5-point framework to help our clients. We have a lot of shared clients and a lot of shared connections through innovation in a tough economy. And I'm going to start with sort of laying the foundations and setting the scene. And this hopefully will resonate with a lot of you, because winning in the real world is really tough. And especially with innovation, it is tough. It is tougher than ever because, as we all know, things are happening. We have lived through the most disruptive times imaginable in the last sort of 2-3 years. Pressure is on us all, internally, externally, deliver cheaper, faster, better. You need competitive advantage. You need to win in the real world. So you think about the disruptions that are not just more significant, they are more frequent. And it's that whole thing about, if time travelers came to our period, they'd just hang up their heads in despair. It's ridiculous. Brexit, COVID, that big ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, China, USA, Taiwan, the tensions there, Russia, Ukraine, all of this going on. But what does that actually mean for this webinar, and what does that mean for us? So practical implications, global supply chains and distribution disruption massively, manufacturer stops, slows, cost increase, human implications, and this can't be underestimated enough. Needs, priorities, sensibilities change all of the time, faster than ever before. So yes, our fundamental needs may be the same, but the way we respond to products, brands, services is different. And there's a key red line running through this webinar and running through our sort of framework, and the word is resilience. Resilience is key. So when you're thriving and you're designing innovative products, services, solutions, you've got to make them more resilient. You have to adapt quicker to challenges as these significant disruptions as they occur. And one of the first steps to this, we were talking about actually the background, and it was emerging economies growing as well, Kristo, and what that means for the rest of us.
No, absolutely. The buying power of emerging economies is growing all the time. And if we look at countries like China and India, they seem to be consuming more and more of the product they produce, and they seem to be less reliant on export. So on the other hand, we look at what leading economies are doing, and the majority of the decisions they seem to be taking these days, they tend to benefit the local business environment rather than cross-border trading. So it begs the question whether this is the beginning of the end for globalization, and what does that mean for businesses? Every article I tend to read these days kind of tends to encourage businesses to innovate and be resilient, but what does that actually mean, and how do you actually deliver it in this new normal? And where we started the conversation with yourself is looking at innovation strategies. And as you know, most of the businesses we work with, they take that 10, 20, 70% approach, where 10% of the projects would be disruptive innovation, 20% of the projects would be step innovation, and the bottom 70 is the sustaining innovation. But in reality, and from experience, we know that in disruptive times, businesses will be forced to innovate beyond product development, and the effort they need to make into innovating with business models, or whether it's supply chain or manufacturing methods or new materials or whatever it is going to be significant. So in reality, that top 30% is going to grow and the bottom 70% is going to shrink. And it is the 70% actually that funds that disruptive innovation, the top 30%. So the big question for us really is, how do we find the funding and how do we find the resources to continue with that disruptive and step innovation and continue to be relevant in a very demanding marketplace? And the answer is, obviously, we've produced this five-point framework, which we're going to talk about in a second. But just to summarize, the answer has to be optimize the development process and make sure that you commercialize innovation sooner. So taking concepts to market sooner means you can create that additional revenue that brings that balance back. But also, the word resilience, make sure you have as much control as a business over as much of the process as possible. So when those behavior shifts start happening, you're actually in a position to respond faster and adjust your proposition to clients.
Brilliant. And I think, yeah, it's all right saying this, but you're probably going, but how? But how? So let's come on to that. And the first bit, and this isn't going to be a massive shock to anyone, hopefully, is we need to do foundational understanding. From a research point of view, do you really know your target? Do you know your consumer, your customer, your end user? How well do you know them? And I think most companies do this. It doesn't seem like anything new, but do you know them today? Because even if you did it a year ago, things will have changed. You now is the perfect time to do that really deep foundational understanding. But it isn't just about understanding where they are now. We've got to build in that level of resilience. So again, you're creating MPD for a world that could change any second. So yes, what is a human problem we're trying to solve? What is a pain point we're trying to overcome? We've also got to think about other elements. So first off, superiority. And again, you might think you know superiority, but what does it really look like? Because I'm going to use my twin brother's Yorkshire pudding theory here to explain my point. So he's a geography teacher, a relevant fact, but just a bit of context. He buys Aunt Bessie's Yorkshire pudding. So Aunt Bessie's, if you call, and I call you doing an absolute great job, because they are the best. You know, they meet a need for him. He's a big eater. He loves Aunt Bessie's, but he's trying to save money. So what he did is he went to, I think it was Sainsbury's, top tier Yorkshire puddings. Right, they're still soft, they're still got a great rising, and they taste great. Put a bit more gravy on them, they're absolutely fine. They're acceptable. He's traded down because he was trying to save money. He's got 2 young kids, every penny counts. What he then did, he was like, okay, I've got used to this. This is acceptable. He traded down. Next tier, so I think that was sort of the standard standard level of the Sainsbury's Yorkshire pudding. The next one was the economy, like the entry level into the system. He traded down, and actually it wasn't good enough. No matter how much Bisto you put on that, it didn't taste nice. So he went up again. He went up a level, but he has not gone all the way back to the top. He employed that rationalization. How can I move? So when you're looking for superiority, when you're looking at foundational truths, you really have to mean that there's a difference between your product and the direct competition. It is so important. You're not just looking at a like-for-like product. Look up, look down, look to the side. You've also got to understand about the consumer perceived competitor set. And I think we all know our categories very well. But you know, for car manufacturers, your competition, yes, it's another car manufacturer, but as you'll know, it is a bus, it is a train, it's walking. That we always talk about the biggest threat to a pizza is actually a fish finger. And Kristo says I have to actually explain this a bit more. But if you think about it, you've done your foundational understanding, so you know the need for pizza for many people is it's quick, it's easy, yes, it's delicious, but if you're a parent and you're trying to get your kids out of the door very, very quickly, what can you do? You can slam a pizza in the oven and it takes 20 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever, and it is done. A fish finger takes a similar amount of time. It literally meets the same need. You've got to understand your perceived boundaries. You've also got to push your foundational understanding further. Again, be more resilient. What are the coping mechanisms that employ if, you know, a ship gets stuck in another really big canal with your products on? Where will they go? What are the coping mechanisms? So This second point here is be more rigorous with your concept and your product testing, and whether it's a concept of an actual product test or just a sort of SWOT style analysis, you have got to make sure they will perform versus your current product's immediate competitor set. Test tier up, test tier down, perceived competition, remember that fish finger, and versus coping mechanisms as well. The other thing is being more resilient is you have to really check that they mean they're going to want this product, because I think we've all seen concept tests, and we'll probably do it ourselves as well, where we go, oh my God, yes, would you buy that? Yes, 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 I'd buy that. Absolutely. What's the risk to me with this product? Of course I'll buy it. It looks lovely, it looks delicious, or it's going to work really well. Ask them again 3 days later. Now, this doesn't have to be a huge test. It could be ask them 3 questions. Just, it could be a quant test. It could be a qual. Ask them 3 days later about the product you were talking about that they've all loved. Would you buy it? Because by then they've got back to their real world, their real lives, their coping mechanisms, their real competitor set. And, if you see that either flat at worst case or improved, brilliant, you're on the win and on to a winner. I'm still thinking about a concept a client showed me 3 weeks ago. It looks so delicious. It's 3 weeks, I'm still thinking about it. If you see that uplift, you're on to a winner. If you see a downturn after 3 days, you need to stop, you need to pause, because that is not going to have the real world resilience. You're going to lose your MPD. But this is all very well, and I think we're used to talking about the consumer problem, but what we're not used to thinking about very, very early on is the less exciting, more practical stuff that is Kristo's speciality and that he'd like to talk about. So again, thinking about delivering stability in an unstable world, I'll hand over to Kristo.
No, thank you, Kana. You're absolutely right. We need to make sure we build on the right foundations, but I think this is a really good opportunity to rethink how we innovate and how we design new product, because the end goal should be actually delivering that proposition and taking it to market as soon as possible to be able to commercialize that concept. And the point I wanted to make is that if we look at the design process and how we design, normally there is an analytical approach and an empirical approach to designing your product. And the analytical stuff is great, and you can solve some of the problems on paper. You can do calculations, you can do simulations, you can do all sorts of exercises that help you get there as much as you can. But really, the majority of the real world feedback happens in that stage where it's the more empirical, the more iterative approach, where you test and you get that feedback. So this really is a great opportunity to rethink how we do things and actually set the right criteria at the right time. For example, we all know that any decent design team will consider the manufacturing suitability of a product. They're going to think of how they're going to make it, what manufacturing methods, what materials, how can we potentially optimize the product further down the line. But in reality, we all know that the majority of that work happens after we successfully test the prototype, when we have a concept sign off, and when we pretty much decided which way we're going to go. There is an opportunity here to actually bring that thinking a little bit forward and say, okay, as a business, what we need to think about is not only delivering this proposition, but how are we going to remain responsive? If the consumer behavior changes, how are we going to introduce that changes as quickly as possible? And how are we going to control as much of that process as we can? And it really pays off to actually think about your current setup and your manufacturing capabilities and partners, and actually design the new version of this and see what gives you that control and how does that setup can be adjusted to actually give you that control. Whether this is a hybrid system of an overseas supply or whether this is a more local supply chain, there are different options, and I suppose in the context of different businesses, that proposition would look different. But we have an opportunity to bring that thinking forward and actually make the decision-making factor in the design brief and say, obviously, we don't want to affect the conceptual thinking and the blue sky stuff, but we really need to push the design team and say, you need to be blue sky thinkers with your feet firmly on the ground, and you need to deliver this proposition within the context of the supply chain or within the delivery mechanism we can use to become a little bit more resilient. And a good way of doing this is another opportunity to optimize the journey and reduce those iterations and those additional stages that come down the line is actually have a look at how we do design briefs and whether they're actually a watertight document or whether they're just a wish list. Because the majority of the times when we start a project, we see a list of features that need to be achieved. So it's really important to start thinking differently about this part of the process and say, okay, the list of features, we're actually going to have to, first of all, give them a level of priority. Typically, we use the must, should, and may approach, where a must, if we don't achieve something, that's detrimental to the product. Should is, if we don't achieve it, we must justify why we can't achieve this feature. And a may is a nice to have, but in a way, we're going to be pushing the design team to actually produce something within the context of our new desired supply chain. They're going to have to balance functionality. They're going to have to balance different ideas and decide where the trade-offs are. So actually giving them that clarity on what's important and what's less important will give them that opportunity to actually make those decisions quicker and shorten that development cycle. The other thing we need to make sure we have in a design brief is a very clear criteria of how we measure success. It is not enough to actually say we need to achieve this and this is a must criteria. We need to have a clear way of measuring success, and that either needs to be a number or we need to specify a process which allows us to test for that success. And it's a really useful exercise actually, because very often we haven't got those criteria ready. The business actually hasn't got that knowledge of how do we test success. And that opens a completely different conversation and actually may provoke you thinking on whether a feature is a must or a should. So it's a really good exercise, and it allows you to holistically set up the priorities for the business, not only from a product delivery point of view, but a business model delivery as well. So there will be a number of opportunities we can discuss, but really optimizing that design process is hugely important to be able to commercialize that concept sooner. And the other opportunity is actually, again, is still in the early stages, and it's taking the fail fast approach as early as possible, making those initial stages a little bit heavier and moving the risk forward, but actually taking that real world feedback as quickly as we can.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think that is key. So just thinking back to what Kristo is saying, that other step in the framework is think about the end goal, think about how you're going to get there faster, because that's what builds in the resilience. If, again, I use the ship because I just found it hilarious. So can't really laugh about the Ukraine thing, but you can laugh about a ship stuck in a canal. You know, what does that mean? If that happens again in your design, your logistics process, what does that mean? And this point and that point and this next point about agile prototyping and fail fast approach is the sort of interchangeable at when they happen. But this is so important. So typically, when you do research, people give consumers, customers, whether it's a service, whether it's a product, whatever, they give you 4 or 5 different concepts, and you've already thought about them, so they're already quite good. But you're showing me something that's very similar. I don't know what to do with it. It's very hard. So I might love them, but how can you really respond to something? How can you really disrupt? How can you really innovate if you're giving people things to look at which are pretty much the same? So prototype faster, be more disruptive faster. So instead of just having a look at 4 or 5 different options, get to 15, get to 20, get them, if where possible, not possible in all categories, I know, but get them off the page and into people's hands. Prototype, low fidelity prototypes are absolutely wonderful, whether it's cardboard, plastic, 3D printing, whatever it is. And obviously if you're in your food and drink, we'll come on to that in a few minutes, but get them into people's hands, because the real world measures is absolutely key to success. And you've done your foundational understanding. So these tests don't need to be big. You can sense check these prototypes, how people are handling them, holding them, tasting them, exploring them, versus that foundational understanding. But remember, you're not just checking them versus what they're currently using. Check them off against their coping mechanisms and their random competitors that they believe are your competition. So you're doing several things by getting things into people's hands. You're checking versus it actually meets the needs, but you're also unlocking other opportunities, because the more extreme and disruptive these prototypes are, the more they're challenging current behavior. So you'll give something to me. I'm going to use a pen as an example. You give me this pen and you're telling me it's a new laundry product or whatever it is. So how are we actually using this prototype? How are people holding it, using it? What needs does it fulfill that you haven't even expected? So you're learning something, you're ticking off more than in the original brief. So again, it's a learning opportunity. And share every single bit with your design team as well. Research and designers should be working together, as I think we've proved, Kristo. There's no egos. You're working towards the same goal for superiority, for winning in a very tough economy. Everything you can glean from these prototypes will take you further. And again, what it does, having more disruptive prototypes when you're innovating as well, or even if the concept stage, is you're creating those parameters for excellence in design. So obviously if it's practical, you're saying it should be like this. If it's not, but same if it's a service model. If you physically can't get prototypes that you need manufacturing. If you're not a packaging heavy operation, for example, if it's food or drink or a service, go to the supermarket and you've got some potential options internally, but you've probably got an Asda or a Tesco next door. Go there, grab baskets of potential options and food. And if consumers are struggling to articulate against the products that you have got and the prototypes you have got, you can go, oh, it needs more bite, it needs more crunch, it needs more sweetness, and they reach for that apple, that orange, that tangfastic, whatever it is. So you can use other stimulus as well to get you further in this early stages. And I think there's something here, and Kristo was talking to me about flexibility of prototypes as well, because I think this message overlays quite well.
No, absolutely, Hannah. And it's just taking a more practical approach and looking at the whole development process and finding out which parts of the process you can optimize without losing the value. We all know that prototyping is hugely important because that's the designer's mechanism of getting that real world feedback and allowing them to adjust that proposition. But I think when it comes to prototyping, we all know we normally go through these cycles of prototyping, design optimization, prototyping, design optimization, and that can carry on forever if you don't take a more structured approach to the journey. So what I would suggest is actually one thing we never consider and think about is we always want these cycles to allow the design team and their thinking to evolve and mature. But what we're not thinking is actually that the consumer's thinking also needs to evolve and mature. So coming back to what you said earlier, absolutely get in with those low fidelity prototypes as early as possible. It doesn't have to be anything sophisticated, but get something physical in your targeted consumer's hands and get that feedback. And once you actually decide on the direction you want to take forward and flesh it out a little bit further and move towards the more high fidelity prototype, when you go in that prototyping stage, don't just create a representation of what you're thinking and what you're hoping to achieve. Give yourself the flexibility to tweak things during the conversation with your focus group. So if you're designing a handheld device, make the handle boltable so you can take it off. You can put different shapes on, different materials, you can clip on different features, you can take things off. But actually, when you're doing those observational studies and those interviews with clients, just bring enough materials to actually say, oh, by the way, you can also do this, and just add to it. In a way, think of prototyping as an ideation session with your targeted consumer, not only what do you think about my proposition, and just get them engaged and get them involved. And you spoke about fish fingers being the biggest competitor to a pizza can. This is how you actually capture these opportunities to innovate and actually tie your product and your proposition with other bits and pieces that are happening in people's life that you haven't necessarily considered. So it is hugely important to actually have a much more flexible approach when it comes to prototyping and getting that feedback.
And I think even at this stage, we mentioned sort of the point 2 in the framework was asking people again, or point 1 was ask people again 3 days later. Again, this is a perfect opportunity. They've gone home, they've played. You don't need many people, 12 people playing with these prototypes. Ask them again, just send them a message, get them to email you. What do you think now? Because actually you could have unlocked something else. They could have been sitting there going, do you know what, if I had that now, that would change my life. So you're trying to disrupt, you're trying to think differently, and you're letting your consumers help you in completely new ways. And I think this is a brilliant example Kristo gave me of a handle as well. So if you've got a product, like so you can make something bigger, smaller, but you can add bits to it as well. You've got your prototype, you can unlock, take off. Kristo explains it better. Go on, Kristo, I'm going to let you take this bit. Explain the handles.
The modular approach, I mean, very
Yeah.
often, you could think of the evolution of handles. Everybody thought back in the day, these finger grips are a great idea. And then we found out that they never fit 2 people exactly the same way. And they were a bad idea. So what we're saying is, there's always that initial thinking and that opportunity to come up with something. But the value of this process, the prototyping process, is getting that feedback. So giving yourself the opportunity to actually go with 3 to 4 different shapes that you want to test on the same product. Give yourself the option to replace them and actually get that feedback, but also give yourself the opportunity to actually, whether it's the back end of the handle is solid plastic and the front is clay, but just give your targeted consumer to actually have that input into the design process as well. And it's just the opportunity to, it's simply a modular approach. Prototyping, Hannah, it's just being able to change all these features and not only test the ideas you have, but actually make your targeted consumer part of your design team and say, well, if you were to design it, what would it look like? And it's just giving yourself that flexibility. And the reason it's important is because that means that you're very likely going to reduce the number of cycles of prototyping and ideation you're going to go through. And if you remember, the whole point of this conversation is how do we provide that framework and advice or methodology to reduce that development cycle and actually help concepts get to market sooner so we can generate that additional revenue.
I think you can do it later on as well. So taking this modular approach, we will say it's not just something that you have to apply for prototyping. Think about it. And again, we know this isn't going to be relevant for all categories or certainly the service members that are on here. But again, think when it is out in the real world, again, things are happening. Is it a modular approach to actually updating your product when needs have changed, when sensibilities have adapted? Do you actually have to start from scratch, or is there something you can bolt on, take off, unlock? Is it something that you could do within the current manufacturing capabilities rather than having to start again? Because so often, again, I think we might have said this already, but up to 20%, around 20% of innovation sort of is dead or dying within the first 2 years, and probably it's a great product. Sometimes it isn't, but often it is a really good product, but actually needs and sensibilities have changed around them, or there's new competition that's come in that's doing it better. So again, think modular when you've got products actually in the market as well. You don't need to necessarily start from scratch every time.
That's a really interesting point, Hannah, and I actually came across the same numbers a couple of weeks ago. I think it's 16 or 18% of innovation is either dead or dying within a couple of years. But if you actually think why, it's not because the proposition was bad in the first place. It's just the business didn't have the capability of adapting that proposition quickly enough, because consumer behavior and needs change, but the business wasn't resilient and responsive enough to introduce that change sooner. So when we talk about resilience, it does really mean having as much control as possible over the full process and actually spotting these opportunities and introducing those changes as quickly as we can.
And just to sum up to this point then, we've got a few things to think about. So that upfront foundational understanding, nothing new in that, but what needs to be new is you've got to do it versus coping mechanisms, up, down, sideways, whatever it is. So this more rigorous SWOT analysis. You've got to make manufacture a driver factor in design process. Think about those logistics up front. You've got to maximize the value of your prototypes by taking this fail faster approach. And you've got to keep sort of continuous research after launch as well to make sure you can act quickly and make changes sort of potentially in a modular way. And it sort of brings us to our final point, and we will have time for questions at the end, but I think this is a really interesting one. So it's a way of working one, and we're more than happy to pick up conversations afterwards because we know this is quite top level still. But this final point is be clear on what you know and what you don't know. And Kristo, I'd love you to expand on this.
No, absolutely. I think it will be absolutely crucial for businesses to have access to skills and knowledge and resources, and not just access, but actually quick access, because if we want to be responsive and actually introduce those changes quickly, we almost need to create like an ecosystem of partners that help us deliver our proposition. And understanding what we're good at and what we're not good at not only allows us to actually prioritize those strategic partnerships and start building them, but actually it's important to actually have the right conversation and choose the right partners, not only to help you overcome short-term hurdles and help you deliver a specific project, but actually help you build that internal knowledge and overcome internal barriers to innovation. It's really important to actually create that holistic ecosystem of partners that really help you grow as well as innovate. And whether this is training sessions, whether this is knowledge transfer workshops, it's really important to be very clear of where the risks are and actually find the right businesses to support you on that journey and make sure they give it that responsive way and that opportunity to be responsive to market changes.
And I think it sort of brings you on to the bigger point as well. So it's about partnerships as well. So yes, you need to have your supply network all together, and that's not just agency side, that's logistical suppliers, that's consultants, that's your internal teams again working together in more efficient ways again, which sounds obvious, but ultimately it's looking at competitors differently as well. And the best example, Kristo's got an amazing example, but it's not competition, it is more about collaboration. And there's a couple of things like this, a couple of ways of working this. So one of our clients, a leading global brand in the sort of the snacking territory, they had very new packaging that they wanted to make it and launch it and get it into stores very quickly, because they wanted to see, can we actually make this work? Will this win in the world? Will this win in the real world? But to be absolutely certain, yes, we've done all the testing up front, but to be absolutely certain, we need to get it into a supermarket. The challenge was they could not make the packaging on their lines. And who in the right mind is going to build a packaging, a whole manufacturing plant based on an idea or a hypothesis, even with the robust numbers behind it? No one. So what they did is they reached out to somebody who actually manufactured cigarette cartons and said, can you make this? And yes, there was some commerciality there, obviously you had to talk it through, but what actually happened, they said yes. So by partnering with a category that was completely alien but had that technology, that need, they unlocked something brilliant. And what this did, it gave them market resilience as well, because it got them to the market faster. They were the first in the market with this, but it also meant that they could take it out easier as well. They didn't have this big expense of this machinery sitting there when they didn't need it. So again, also it's thinking differently in terms of partnerships and collaboration. And I think something quite exciting is happening in the world of cars, isn't it?
I think so, but yeah, before I mention this, I would say that's actually the example you gave, Hannah, is a typical example of why actually bringing that manufacturing conversation right up front in the ideation stages is so important, because it's one thing actually designing that proposition and say, okay, what are the options now? Who do we need to talk to? And if you're a visionary business, you can find these opportunities and they can happen. But imagine having sight of this right at the beginning and giving yourself another 6 months to actually put the right infrastructure in place and have the right conversations and bring the right businesses on site. That would have been a lot less risk and I'm sure a much easier journey. But the example I was going to give is the collaboration of BMW and Mercedes, and they got together and they looked at the space and the need of taking a person from A to B a little bit more holistically, and they did a lot in the space of shared taxis, shared cars, electric scooters. They put apps together, and as a result, actually, they're competitors, but they have captured a bigger market share. And it just shows that the consumer is no longer focused on, the importance is not necessarily on the brand, it really is on the need. And it's interesting to see actually bigger companies and bigger competitors joining force to add more value to their proposition and actually really show that they understand the consumer's mindset and that they're willing to work together to provide the next best thing.
Brilliant. And so just to reiterate, sorry, I've seen questions coming through, so I'm just having a quick look at the questions that have been sent through. So at this point, obviously, there's several things that can be done differently to this framework, so just think about it. And we will say, for some of you, you will know this. I've seen the sign-up list, so I know we have a lot of leading global giants listening, so no pressure. But I think those things, remember, upfront foundational standing, that rigorous SWOT analysis, manufacture a driving factor in the design process, maximize the value of prototyping by this fail fast approach. But really, it's about collaboration. Really think where your partners are internally, externally. How can you unlock something further down the line? How can you unlock something logistically that will make your product more resilient in the real world? Because that is ultimately how we win, how we thrive in a very tough economy through innovation. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you got something out of it. So I appreciate that some of it was quite top line, but there's just so much detail to go into. But if nothing else, hopefully found a little bit of inspiration to think differently. You can win in a tough economy. It's just about ensuring everything you do, service, product, is thought ahead. It's all about resilience. But thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we will see you all soon. Take care. Bye.
Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed this webinar. We look forward to discussing these topics in a lot more detail in the future, and please feel free to get in touch if you want to discuss anything in the meantime.